is sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's a problem. Sometimes, particularly in recent times, it's had great advantages for us as a church. And that's what I want to consider by the end, especially when we come to the 20th century. Let me start by looking at this first contrast. Voluntary establishment. America America is a country that was built from scratch, built by people coming and doing for themselves all that they could do. It wasn't it was, I don't want to say every man for himself, but there was a tremendous independence of the early American colonists. Labor was of primary importance, there were not strong institutions here of government, of church, to organize the Americans. The Americans were remarkably independent, the early colonists were. And so the tradition of voluntarism, of doing things for yourselves, is a great American tradition that still makes America quite different from other countries, I think. Whereas the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was the established church. Now, when I was a kid, I was told that the longest word in the dictionary is anti-disestablishmentarianism. You've heard that? Yeah. Do you know what it means? It means Church of England people. They always get the longest words, right? It's very... No, anti-disestablishmentarianism means those, this is a word from the 19th century, those who are opposed to the disestablishment of the church. The fact that the Church of England is the established church is probably the single most important fact about the Church of England in England. And what does it mean to be established? Well, in the Middle Ages there was only one church. Then after the Reformation there were many churches. But in each country there was only one church, or one official church. Right? So you got a lot of denominations in the Reformation, but each country only had one. And of course in England there was the Church of England. And that establishment meant that the king, the government, the king, finances, is supported financially and legally by the church. The king is the head of the church, and only members of the established church have full rights in society. Only they can be members of parliament or go to the universities and other such privileges. Other Protestants did exist in England, of course. They were dismissively referred to as dissenters. And that some of the dissenters ended up in America hoping to find full freedom for their religious practice and political rights as well. But that wasn't true in the southern colonies of the United States. Well, let me say that when Jamestown was founded in 1607, there was an Anglican minister on the boat. So it's ironic that the Anglican Church is at odds, so much at odds with American tradition, when you consider that we were the first to be here, and we've had more presidents than any other church, and yet we're so much at odds with America. It's funny that. One of the ironies of history. Okay. So in Jamestown, Jamestown is the beginnings of the Virginia colony, and then the other southern colonies, Maryland, originally was established as a Catholic colony, but it quickly was converted to an Anglican colony. Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, the southern colonies, all were eventually had the Church of England as the established church. So there was the extension of the establishment to the colonies, which meant that in Virginia, land was set aside for the use and income of the church, and the House of Burgesses, which originally met in an Anglican church, to form itself in what was the year 1619, was responsible for the church and established vestries, elected vestries, that would have been responsible for the upkeep of the church. So in a sense, again, church and state were united. And the same was true, by the way, in the northern colonies. The Congregationalists also established their church as the established church. In a similar pattern, where the state government both controls and is responsible for the well-being of the church, and other people outside the church do not have full rights. Although the limitation of rights in the American colonies was not so consistently practiced as it was at home. Parishes and vestries set aside the glebe land, but there was no bishop. That was the difference. You had an established church, but there was no bishop. There were no bishops. This is a funny thing about the British Empire. You know, they extend British culture, but not completely. The colonies were never really considered entirely part of the United Kingdom, and so it wasn't necessarily assumed that there would be the creation of dioceses and all the full apparatus of the church. First of all, there were many people there to begin with in the colonies. Altogether, they probably amounted to not even a diocese in terms of England. And there's money, and there's lack of labor and other problems. But eventually, it was resistance of the American colonists themselves, which ultimately prevented the introduction of any kind of bishop in the colonies. And the lack of bishops, I'm going to talk about later, is a major problem for the church. After all, we are the church based on bishops, and we don't have any in the colonies. And the biggest problem, as you can imagine, twofold. If you consider the Virginia establishment, the churches were under the control of the vestry. And they had no bishop over them, or working with them. And so the landlords, the local landed gentry of Virginia, were in total control of the church. You see, they had no interest in bringing in bishops. Right? They liked it just the way it was. Thank you very much. Sure. And the other problem, which by the way, Bill can sympathize with this, no doubt. Which if the landed gentry are in total control of the church without any oversight, you can imagine that the pay was often very poor. for the clergy.
A lot of chickens too.
The other thing, of course, you have to remember is that without a bishop, all the Anglican clergy had to be ordained in England, where the bishops were. So you had, if you were an American colonist and you wanted to become an Anglican priest, you had to travel to England, which took 3 weeks, and a dangerous voyage, and then travel back. You know, it was low pay and all the hazards and problems of becoming an ordained instrument. That there was a low supply, and the church was kept kind of weak comparatively. In fact, by 1700, about half of the Virginia parishes weren't even staffed. So yeah, you got an established church, but it's not very well established. Let's put it that way. I should say as well that there's another wrinkle in this. There was another place in which the Anglican Church was established, and that was New York City. New York was conquered by the British Army from the Dutch in 1670, mostly, 1664. And when it was conquered, it became a kind of a royal colony, and the Anglican Church was established in New York City and surrounding counties. And today, New York is still a bastion of Episcopalianism, right? And so it is. Even though the church was established, as I said, even in New York City, it wasn't very well established, as I mentioned. And in the northern colonies like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and up north, there was virtually no Anglican presence at all. One church in 1700 in all of New England. One.
That's all it took.
What's more is, not only was the establishment incomplete, even where it was established, but it also got the downside of being the established church without having all the pluses. The church became associated with the planter class, the aristocratic planter class of the southern colonies, and therefore there was a kind of a class conflict. The church was considered to be an elite church, and there was some dislike of the church for its privilege, even though it didn't have as much privilege as it probably wanted, as it was. At the end of the 1600s, England passed through some political turmoil, which I can't go into, a couple revolutions, okay, but emerged behind the dual monarchs, William and Mary. And the fact that they were dual monarchs is an interesting fact. In 1689, William was a Dutch prince, which is why they had dual monarch. Mary was the English one, so they had both. And was involved in fighting the very Catholic and very powerful Louis XIV, the great king of France, for power in Europe. And he was now the Prince of Holland and the King of England, which made him the leader in the conflict against Catholicism and Louis XIV. And it was at this time that he and the English government in general became very interested. Well, and I should say, this is the beginning of a century-long struggle between the superpowers of the day, England and France. 18th century is all about the struggle between those two superpowers, and of course, who wins? England. And part of that power struggle goes on in North America. They call it the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. That happens a little later. But this is the beginning of that struggle between the superpowers. And in this struggle, then, much of it over control of colonies around the world, the English government is starting to suddenly become more interested in the American colonies, and more interested in their management, more interested in their success, more involved. And one of the aspects of that involvement, William and Mary and their daughter Anne, the next queen, became very interested in building up the Anglican Church in the colonies. And they tried unsuccessfully to extend the establishment in the colonies. But the more important development was just a general movement among the English leaders, aristocrats, and others to try to reinforce the Anglican Church in the colonies. And the most important movements were, first of all, the Bishop of London made himself sort of the bishop of the colonies, because of course London is where the government is, and all the merchants that deal with the colonies are. So in a sense, he's the bishop of the colonies, or made himself that. He appointed a commissary for himself to go and represent him, the bishop, and with powers and authority in the colonies to try to bring up the level of education and discipline among the clergy, and hope to organize some more support for the clergy in the colonies. One of them, a man by the name of Blair, founded the William and Mary College in order to provide a higher education for Anglicans in the colonies. Another commissary by the name of Bray organized the SPCK, Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, okay, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Two organizations. One was designed to bring Bibles and other literature and set up libraries in the colonies. The other was designed to fund missionaries and priests, which is, of course, desperate need in the colonies. These organizations really turned the tide for the colonial church, because they organized aristocrats and wealthy people in England to donate their money to support the expansion of the church, build churches, and most importantly, send priests, especially to the northern colonies where there was no Anglicanism at all. And that's where the SPG people were most active, in New England and surrounding the middle colonies. Now, you might imagine that it was the SPG, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, missionaries who were naturally the most zealous, fervent Anglicans to be found. and they were kind of trying to build the church from nothing in the north, you can imagine that even, well, it's true that even today, the Anglican churches, the Episcopal churches in the north, in New England and Middle Atlantic states, tend to be higher and more formal and more traditional than the other Anglican churches of the South or of the Midwest. So that difference still holds true today. You can imagine that there's an irony in this great turning point for the church, because the reason that they finally were so successful and was helping to build the church is because they finally realized that America was about voluntary organization. You weren't going to get the church established. There was no aristocracy established to build the church. You had to do it voluntarily. You had to go out and organize. You had to get donors and missionize. You had to be a voluntary organization. And so the Church of England, with these organizations, learned to be voluntary. But the irony, of course, was that the SBG guys in there were just dying to establish the church, you know. So it was a voluntary organization to establish the church and to bring in a bishop. So they were really keen on that, to establish the church and to bring in a bishop. Listen to the voice of one of the SBG missionaries in Pennsylvania in 1764. Listen to what he has to say about his job. It is the unanimous opinion of all here who wish to the preservation and enlargement of the church, that in the settlement of our conquests in America, application should be made in the very beginning for the allotment of lands toward the support of a clergy regularly ordained by our church. Now he's saying, as we spread west, we've got to establish. We've got to set aside land and property for the church. Then he describes the dissenters. And the reason why the Anglican Church is special and different and better than the rest. The state of the dissenters' several congregations are rather too evident from their scandalous differences and animosities, each within itself as well as one another. The people are ever and anon quarreling with their preachers, whom of humor and caprice they change much oftener than their clothes. See, that's terrible from an Anglican point of view. A minister here must double his guard and deny himself many of the innocent comforts and liberties of life, and undergo as many of its inconveniences, toils, and troubles, if ever he would succeed in work, particularly in frontier missions. And there's a couple of interesting things in that statement. One is that the Anglicans viewed themselves as organized and legitimate and rational as compared to the emotional, disorganized dissenters. It also suggests at the end there his distaste for the Puritanism, which was typical of the American colonists. You know, their moralism. You know, I can't even, you know, probably he's talking about I can't have a nice drink of wine without being attacked by my parishioners, right? You know, where is the order in society here? I could have put disorderly, right? and Anglicans are orderly, right? And that's what was going on. Let me sum up this first one anyway, and say it is in its attempt to recreate the established church, Anglicans utterly failed. The reliance on the establishment was a great weakness until they learned to organize on a volunteer basis. And even then they sought the establishment, which put them at odds, as that statement just proves, at odds with Americans generally. All right, let me go to the next one.
Chris,
Yes?
I have a question for you. During that period of time in the 18th century, did you still have to be Anglican to be like part of the governing body of the?
No, it was more of an informal thing, I think. As I said, they didn't apply it very much.
Well, I know when we were in Williamsburg, we talked about you got fined if you were a member of the Anglican Church.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's on the books. And if the local vestry wants to assert pressure on people, they could do it.
Well,
Generally, it wasn't.
They kind of got around it. You know,
Yeah,
it's okay to pay
just-
the fine. You know, just be a member of a different church and
Yeah.
pay that fine.
That kind of happened in England too, actually. There was these kind of what they were called disabilities in England. these disabilities sort of gradually faded away as people just sort of didn't press them. And as in fact, in America, Anglicans were a minority, so it was difficult for them to press their advantage too far in the long run. Good question. Let me go to the next one, this contrast between revivalism and anti-revivalism. It wasn't only the SPG missionaries who were concerned about questions of discipline and order in the colonies. In 1722, 7 Congregationalist ministers associated with Yale University issued a declaration that non-Episcopal orders, their orders, were not legitimate. They had had a conversion kind of experience. They were early enlightened. They were influenced by the early Enlightenment philosophers and theologians in England, who emphasized the rational order of all of nature, and the corresponding idea that church and society should be rationally and carefully ordered. 4 of the 7 who turned away from the Congregationalists traveled to England to become reordained as Anglicans. One of them was Samuel Johnson, who was later in 1754 the first president of King's College, which became Columbia University in New York City. So Columbia University started out as an Anglican college, and then after the Revolution, it was kind of became an independent university. This conversion to Anglicanism by these 7, however, was dwarfed by one of the great religious movements of all time, called the Great Awakening, starting in 1740. The Awakening was led on both sides of the Atlantic by 2 Anglican clergymen, one George Whitefield and John Wesley. This was the beginning of the evangelical revivalism. As I tell my students in class, evangelicalism can be summarized in the 5 Ps. Personal, passionate, present, practical, and progressive. And I won't go into all that. Well, let's just say the Anglicans were opposed to that. All of it. The emphasis, of course, is placed on personal experience, religious feeling, ethical action, as in contrast to the Anglican emphasis on authority, order, and reason. It's a total contrast to where the Anglican Church was going. Those 7 Congregationalists were concerned about reason and order, and then the mass of Americans getting swept up in the enthusiasm of the revival, which is about emotion and personality. But the fact that the Church of England is moving towards an emphasis on reason and order is not unrelated to the fact that the revival started in the Anglican Church. It was the Church of England that started revivalism. You see, there's a reason there. There's a connection there. One can imagine that many Anglicans were appalled by these changes. One of the 7 Yale intellectuals I mentioned was named Timothy Cutler, and he wrote, as the revival was starting in 1742, "Enthusiasm," this is him saying, "enthusiasm has swelled to much higher degrees of madness. Groups form." Groups form. This voluntary aspect is very disgusting. The groups form of laymen and have started, let's see, he has archaic language. "And some layman or other has started up and strengthened the schism in the exercise of their gifts of praying and preaching, and indeed the ties are fruitful of many such ruling elders, deacons, and other illegitimate mechanics who neglect or lay aside their callings for this purpose, and are much admired by and followed by the people. 2 of them have entered this town, Boston, and affected multitudes. In such places, lectures, especially evening ones, are attended with hideous yellings and shameful revels, continuing till midnight." Now, there it is.
Sounds like a best.
You can see that there was increasing concern for social. You can see this. He's not only concerned about the church order, he's concerned about social and intellectual order. It's irrational, and people are leaving their callings. They're not mechanics, they're not working. Instead, they're becoming preachers, and they're claiming to be preachers like he is. And it's just outrageous. The religious landscape was changed forever because the colonies were swept by these new kind of religious feeling, and only widened the gap between the mainstream of Americans and the Anglican Church. Although many Anglicans were also swept up in this, which created some internal problems in the church. Let me go now to the contrast between democracy and hierarchy. It's no wonder in this environment of the middle of the 1700s that men like Cutler called for, all the more loudly, for a bishop to be appointed, please. The hierarchical authority of bishops was necessary for the good order of the church. Many non-Anglicans saw it as an issue of liberty, or the lack of liberty. The debate reached a climax in the 1760s, and the adamant resistance of the colonists ultimately prevented any action from being taken by the British government, who already had enough trouble at this time keeping the colonists happy. And you'll see that in a minute. One of the Presbyterians who attacked the idea of bishops said that that it would introduce an evil more terrible into every man who sets a proper value to his liberty, property, or conscience than the so greatly and deservedly obnoxious Stamp Act itself. Stamp Act. This statement succinctly illustrates the way in which the very thing that Anglicans wanted most was entirely at odds with the spirit of America, and that contradiction dramatically showed itself in the American Revolution. The controversy over the Stamp Act, the debate over bishops were the opening acts in what became the American Revolution. All the contradictions between the Church of England and America were played out in this revolution. Almost now we're entering, you see, revolutionary versus loyalist contrast. Almost all the Anglican clergy in the middle and northern colonies, the SPG guys mostly, even the self-supporting ones though, almost all of them opposed the revolution and left when the Revolutionary War began. And about half of the southern clergy supported the revolution. Of course, they were supported by their local state and the vestries, so they weren't quite as loyal, I guess, to the British Crown. It was a troubling decision for some to make, but for most, the issue was very clear, especially for the SPG missionaries, who were supported directly with funds from England. They viewed themselves as having taken a sacred vow of loyalty to the king, and that's part of their ordination. Remember that the Church of England was the established church, and the king was the head of the church. And listen to the words of one SPG missionary in 1776. As to myself, I was at no loss in determining what part I should bear in this inopportune juncture. Ever since I entered into the ministry, I had made it a constant rule to read over at proper intervals my ordination vows, the articles of religion, and canons of our church, all the orderly documents. But on the present occasion, I read them more attentively than ever. To say nothing at present of the oath of allegiance to the king, which was evidently framed for securing the subject from joining any foreign power or an attack on the sovereign's crown and dignity. The canons of the church have some a direct and others a general tendency to maintain the king's supremacy in church and state. Charles Inglis, he was the rector of the Trinity Church in New York City, wrote in the same year, 1776, a little more passionate. The present rebellion is certainly one of the most causeless, unprovoked, and unnatural that has ever disgraced any country. A rebellion marked with peculiarly aggravated circumstances of guilt and ingratitude. This declaration of independence increased the embarrassment of the clergy. To officiate publicly and not pray for the king and royal family according to the liturgy was against their duty and oath, as well as the dictates of their consciences. Yet to use the prayers for the king and the royal family would have drawn inevitable destruction on them. The only course which they could pursue to avoid both evils was to suspend the public exercise of their function and shut up their churches. This was accordingly done. So almost all the clergy in the north and 2/3 of them in the south left the colonies, many of them permanently. 2 out of 3 in Virginia left, maybe some out of fear, some out of choice, and some out of poverty, because their incomes were not secure. In all, it's estimated that 70,000 Anglican loyalists left the United States, out of a population of about 3 million total, to mostly going to Canada. Charles Inglis's church, who I just quoted, in New York City was burned to the ground. There were a lot of angry. The Anglican Church was a point of anger for the American colonists because they were associated, quite rightly in most cases, with the crown and with loyalism and opposing the revolution. After the war, the nominally Anglicans, the